We're in this series called Matters of the Heart. And over these past few weeks, we've been thinking about our hearts. We've been asking the question, how's my heart? And we've been doing a bit of self-diagnosis on our own spiritual conditions. And we've still got some more diagnosing to do in the coming weeks as we talk in the coming weeks about generous hearts and bold hearts and pure hearts and guarding our hearts. But this morning we're not looking at our hearts. We're thinking about we're not so much thinking about our own hearts, but thinking more about God's heart. And we're asking the question, what's on God's heart? What kind of heart does God have? And can we possibly have a heart like God's? There's one character in the Bible who has an incredible description said of his heart. This character is mentioned in the Bible more than any other person in the whole of the Bible, and his name is David. He is a central character of the Old Testament. And when you look at the amount of space given to David's life, you realize there's something very important about this man, something very special about this man. David's name is mentioned more than 1,100 times in the Bible. Did you realize that? 1,100 times his name is used. More than 60 times in the New Testament. There are 66 chapters in the Bible devoted to David's life. And we might do a series on David one day because he is such an important part of the story of the Bible. David was a skilled musician. He was a mighty warrior. He was a brilliant military leader. I'm sure most of us will remember the story of that amazing contest, which wasn't really a contest at all, between David and Goliath. And we're going to actually be looking at that next Sunday in our service, in our series. But that was just one of his great military exploits. He was a brilliant statesman. He was a wise politician. He was an amazing poet. He wrote many of the Psalms that express the longing of the human heart. And these Psalms are perhaps the single most important and influential devotional literature ever written. And so David truly was a remarkable man. Handsome, powerful, charismatic, loved by millions, a great, great king. And yet, despite all these remarkable attributes about this man David, there was something else, a description of David's heart that gives us an insight into who he really was, gives us an insight into what really drew God to David. See, it wasn't all David's external accomplishments, all those things he was good at, not what he looked like, not the fact that he was a skilled musician, a mighty warrior, a brilliant leader, a statesman, a poet. What really drew God to David was David's heart. It was David's heart that really made David such a remarkable man. In the book of Acts, written 1,000 years after David lived, we read this remarkable statement about David. God says, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. A man after my own heart. If you can move the slides on, because I can't move them today, thanks. I have found David, a man after my own heart. What did God think of David? God looked beyond all those accomplishments. He looked beyond all of those mighty exploits. He looked beyond even David's failures and his weaknesses, because he certainly had some of those too, didn't he? And he looked at David's heart. And he describes David as a man after my own heart. So what is God's heart like? What is it that God saw in David that he would say, David is a man after my own heart? And so this morning I want to share something of what I believe is on God's heart. And I shared a similar message with you some time ago, but I reckon it's important enough for us to hear it again this morning. Because when we look at God's heart, we see the kind of hearts that I think that he wants us to have as well. There are so many characteristics of God's heart that we could look at, but I want to focus on 4 this morning. A heart of compassion, a heart of justice, a heart of generosity, and a heart of love. And I see those 4 things on God's heart: compassion and justice and generosity and love. And see, I believe that the things that are on God's heart should be the things that are on our hearts as well. Those things that are important to God should be important to us too. So we're looking at compassion and justice and generosity and love this morning. The first one is compassion. The psalmist says in Psalm 103, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him, for he knows how we are formed." And we sang that in our first song this morning that talks about 10,000 reasons. It says, "You're rich in love, and you're slow to anger. Your name is great, and your heart is kind." See, God is a kind God. He's got a heart of compassion. And the Bible is full of the kindness and compassion of God. Compassion is central to God's heart. And we find it through the pages of the Old Testament. And there's this wonderful little phrase that you find over and over and over through the Old Testament. And it says something like this: "The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in love." Don't you love that statement? The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And we read this over and over and over again. And just so we don't forget what God is like, this little phrase is repeated so many times, because I think God wants us to know what he's like. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. And then when we go to the New Testament, we see compassion supremely in Jesus. In one place in Matthew 6, Jesus sees crowds of people who are spiritually confused. And Matthew says, Jesus had compassion on them because he saw that they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus is trying to describe something about the character of God, the character of the Father, he tells a story, an amazing story, and we love that story, the story about the prodigal son. And we all know that story so well. And he tells about this son who comes home from a far-off land. He comes home out of desperation because he's lost everything. And this son, as he comes back home to this farm, he has this little speech prepared to see if his father might perhaps let him stay on as a hired servant. And in the story, Jesus describes what happened. He says, while the boy was still a long way off, his father saw him. And then you have this wonderful little statement in the story. The father saw him a long way off. And the father was filled with compassion. Filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son and he embraced him and he kissed him. That compassionate heart beating. And so we find in God this wonderful heart of compassion. So how about us? How are we doing on this compassion thing? Wonder how we feel when we see people in need. How do we respond when we see needs? No, I reckon many people today feel just so overwhelmed by all the needs around us that, you know what we do? We end up doing nothing. We feel so overwhelmed with all the needs that we just kind of end up doing nothing. And there's a term for that. It's called compassion fatigue. You might have heard of that term, compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue happens when we become so saturated with all the needs out there, all the images of suffering and people in need. And we see it every night on the news, don't we? People in need and disasters happening and things going wrong. And there's so much coming at us all the time that we just feel overwhelmed. And we end up doing nothing. I wonder if Jesus suffered from compassion fatigue. I don't think so. I think he saw the needs around him and he just did what he could. Because he had a heart of compassion. Another quality I see in Jesus is this heart of justice. Where does justice fit into God's character? How just is God? You know, I'm mostly concerned about injustice when I feel like I'm the victim of it. I don't know if it's like this for you, but if I'm speeding, I don't really speed, but you know, just to pretend that I was. If I was speeding, I don't want to see any flashing lights in my rear view mirror, do I? But if someone else comes up behind me and speeds on past me, I'm always thinking, where are those police when you need them most? One of the most important attributes of God is that he's passionately committed to justice. And again, the Old Testament is full of this idea of God being a God of justice. The Psalms talk about how God works righteousness and justice for the oppressed. The Lord loves justice, writes the Psalm. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. And God is so committed to justice that he sent a group of people, and we heard about one of them this morning in our video. He sent this group of people called prophets. And these prophets called the people to justice. Just one example is the prophet Amos. We may not think about Amos or look at Amos very much, but Amos is an interesting prophet. These prophets were masters at getting under the people's skin. And the prophet Amos comes and he starts prophesying and talking to the people. And he starts out about talking about judgment coming on God's enemies. Judgment coming on Israel's enemies. And he says, he prophesies and he says, for 3 sins of Damascus, make that 4, I'm not putting up with her anymore. And Amos, the audience loves this because the prophet's talking about justice coming to their enemies. And Amos continues on, and it's 2 chapters of this, like justice is coming to the Moabites, and justice is coming to the Edomites, and justice is coming to the Ammonites, and all the people of Israel are saying, yay, God, justice is coming to our enemies. That's really good. That's what we want to hear. But then comes the next little part of Israel, of Amos's talk, and this bit's not so easy. Amos is talking to this group of people in Israel. And Amos says, for 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I'm not putting up with them any longer. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. It would have taken an enormous amount of courage for Amos to stand before his own people and declare about the sins of their own people and to declare that justice is coming on God's people. Israel had to understand, as we do, that God is committed to justice. And then Amos says these unforgettable words about justice. He says, let justice roll on like a river. Let justice roll on like a river. It's a wonderful phrase about how God is so committed to justice that he wants to see it rolling on like a mighty river. I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago about the dry Canterbury Plains that we were travelling across in our holiday just recently in the South Island. And we crossed many of those rivers down through the Canterbury Plains, you know, the Waimakariri River and the Rakaia River and the Waitaki and the Selwyn River and a bunch of others. And when we were down there, when we crossed these rivers, they were just like a trickle. There was hardly any water in these rivers. But you could tell in flood season that these trickles became an enormous torrent of water. How could you tell? By the bridges spanning these rivers. I mean, when we were crossing these rivers, it's like these big bridges that just a trickle of water. It seemed crazy to have such a big bridge. But the Rakaia Bridge is New Zealand's longest bridge, 1.8 kilometres long. Now, why would you have such a big bridge for just a trickle of water? Because sometimes there's a torrent of water that comes down. Let justice flow like a trickle? No. Let justice flow like a torrent, like a river raging in flood. See, God is passionate about justice. Let justice flow like a river. Justice is very much a part of God's heart. We seem to be hearing in the news all the time about issues of injustice, don't we? You know, just recently, apologies being issued for the dawn raids of illegal Pacific Island overstayers back in the 70s. The Lake Alice inquiry, which we've been hearing about on the news, which is a major injustice done to our mental health patients. And injustice this week in the news, this news in Canada. Terrible news about hundreds, possibly thousands of unmarked graves that have come to light in residential schools. Graves of Indigenous children who suffered brutal neglect and abuse from earlier last century. And it was just all covered up. And now it's coming to light. These major issues of injustice. And more injustices are coming to light. People looking to right the wrongs that have been done. There's a growing movement of Christians looking to be involved in justice and helping some of the major issues of injustice in our world. And maybe God's putting his finger on some of us to work for justice, perhaps in our community. Justice is very much a part of God's heart. He longs to see a world where people are treated fairly and equitably, people treated with care and respect. And so God's heart is for compassion and it's for justice. Another heart quality we find is generosity. Think for a moment, how generous is God? How generous is God? Well, we find in the Bible, it's full of the generosity of God. In the book of James in the New Testament, we read, every good and perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of all lights. You think of every good thing in your life, everything in your life that's good. Every meal you've eaten, the clothes you wear, the people in your life, the house you live in. We have a generous God who has given us so much. Friends, the God of the Bible is the God of the open hand. He gives and he gives and he gives. Psalm 145:16 says, God, you open your hand and you satisfy the desire of every living thing. Friends, God is a God of generosity. Not only do we as humans experience God's generosity, but all living things, plants and animals experience it as well. God is outrageously generous. He opens his hand and he gives and he gives and he gives. God's heart is a heart of generosity, and he calls us to have a heart like his. So how's your generosity? How's your heart toward generosity? One more heart quality we see in God, and perhaps it's the ultimate quality, and it is love. Out of heart. Love. How loving is God? Well, perhaps one of the most remarkable statements in the whole of the Bible is that simple little phrase, God is love. God is love. Paul says in Romans 5, God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. few moments ago we took the bread and the cup and we remembered the sacrifice that God made for us through Jesus. This ultimate expression of love. That he laid down his life for us. That's not just love, that's costly love. That's self-sacrificing love. That's love for us who don't deserve it, can't earn it, don't merit it. Amazing love. How can it be that thou, my God, should die for me, writes Charles Wesley in that great old hymn. What's on God's heart? Compassion, and justice, and generosity, and love. And in God's heart, he carries a plan for this earth. He's got a dream for this place. And that's what is on his heart. He's got a plan to make all things new. And in our reading this morning from the Jesus Storybook Bible, we heard something about that dream of this new kind of kingdom. The way I believe that God intends it for it to be. Listen to his dream. This is from Isaiah 65. I'm creating new heavens and a new earth. All the earlier troubles, chaos and pain are things of the past to be forgotten. Look ahead with joy. Anticipate what I'm creating. No more sounds of weeping in the city. No cries of anguish. No more babies dying in the cradle or old people who don't enjoy a full lifetime. My people will be long-lived as trees. My chosen ones will have satisfaction in their work. They won't work and have nothing come out of it. They won't have children snatched out from under them. Before they call, I'll answer. Before they've finished speaking, I'll have heard. Wolf and lamb will graze the same meadow. Lion and ox eat straw from the same trough. This is a kind of a picture, an image of the kind of kingdom that God has in mind. That's on God's heart for this old world of ours. The kingdom of God. You know, we're living in a time, we're living in a world when it's not the way it's supposed to be. Earlier we talked about sadness and the things that made our children sad and the things that make you sad. Just this last week, one of my good friends, his name is Chuck, he died. Chuck was a good friend of ours who lived in Japan when we were there. Chuck was always in and out of our house. He ran an international grocery store in Kobe where we lived. He imported foreign food, all the things you crave for from a home that you couldn't normally get in Japan. He imported those. Everyone loved Chuck. Chuck had such an incredible heart for God. He was always telling stories about God incidences in his life. He wouldn't call them coincidences. He always called them God incidences. Every time he came around to our house, which was often, he had another story of something amazing that had just happened that week. God had done something else amazing in his life. But now he's gone. He's no longer with us. Chuck was just 62. He died of cancer. Just not fair. This world is not the way it's supposed to be, friends. Here in our own church family, we've got a number of our church family who are facing major battles with cancer. You know, Marie and Patrick and Glenn and Mike. There are others of you dealing with health problems or family problems or marriage or relational heartaches. Friends, this world is not the way it's supposed to be. But God has this plan, this dream, this new kingdom where all things are made new, where there's going to be joy, where there's no more weeping or crying, where there's no infant mortality, where people live out full lives. There won't be any violence. A world where everything sad will come untrue, as the story said this morning. Doesn't that sound like the kind of world you want to be in? where everything sad will come untrue. As you read through Scripture, you find over and over again that God's heart is for this new kingdom. At the very, very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he announces this new kingdom. He got up in the synagogue and he unrolled a scroll, and Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, that the time of the Lord's favor has come." And that day there in the synagogue, Jesus announces the beginning of this new kingdom. And God's heartbeat, God's dream of a better place, began to become a reality. God's heart of compassion, heart of justice, a heart of generosity, and a heart of love. Care for the poor and the marginalized and the disadvantaged and the least and the lost and the lonely. That day, that dream started to become a reality. God says, "I want you to partner with me in this dream." Friends, if we profess to be part of the kingdom, if we profess to be followers of the king of this kingdom, then we will want to have the same values as the king. Heart of compassion, heart of justice, a heart of generosity, and a heart of love. A man by the name of Bob Pierce, the founder of World Vision, once wrote on the flyleaf of his Bible, he wrote these words, "Let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God." Based on that statement that he wrote, Bob Pierce founded World Vision and Samaritan's Purse, two of the most effective and successful Christian relief agencies that we have today. Let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God. Friends, it's a challenge to us to examine our hearts. Think about what our heart is like of compassion and justice and generosity and love. It's an old song we used to sing. I wonder if the team would come on up. But we're going to sing again this morning. It says, "Change my heart, O God. Make it ever true. Change my heart, O God. May I be like you." Maybe we need to make that our prayer this morning. God, change my heart. May my heart be like yours. Let's stand together.